Hello guys, this is Paul McWhorter with ExtremePreppers.com, and I'm here today to describe to you the Worm Factory 360. We're going to show you how to get it set up, and we're going to show you how to then maintain it once you get it going. First question you might ask is, why would you want to fool with earthworms at all? The reason is I've found that earthworms are the best way to compost. I've tried a lot of different methods of composting. I've tried the outdoor method with the big bins and making piles of stuff. But what I've found is the quickest way to make compost and the way to make the highest quality compost is to use earthworms. And so the reason I am interested in the Worm Factory 360 is it allows me to make the highest quality compost the quickest. The second question you might ask is that, well, if you're going to use earthworms, should you really buy a Worm Factory 360 or other turnkey worm system, or should you just go and build it yourself? Because there's a lot of things on the internet that show you how you can build worm composting systems using things like 5-gallon buckets. When I get into something, I like to start with something that I know is going to work, even if I have to pay a little bit more money. And by starting with the Worm Factory 360, I take a lot of the variables out of it, and I can learn about growing earthworms. And then once I learn about growing earthworms and I start enjoying some success, then I can start thinking about, if I'm going to expand the operation, how I might do it with a system that would be more affordable. But there's a lot of variables when you try to grow earthworms, and it's really important to try to get early success. So a lot of times in doing things like this, I'll spend more by the commercial off-the-shelf system and then learn the business, and then when I expand, maybe try to build things myself. So overall, my impression so far of the Worm Factory 360 is that I've just been really pleased with it. I've had a lot of luck with it, and in fact, I've bought several of them so far. Now, in the future, I might go a different direction as I try to do more and more composting, but right now, I've just been expanding my Worm Factory systems. So composting is great. Worm composting is great, and a great way to get into worm composting is the Worm Factory 360. It comes with everything that you need to get started. I like that it has all the little bags of stuff so that you don't have to run out and find anything. Everything that you need comes with it. So let's talk about how we can get started in getting this thing set up. You can unbox it. It's got several different trays to start with. It has a base unit that you stack everything on, and then it has a lid. Also, one of the neat features is if you start getting kind of a little bit too much moisture in your system, there's a drain valve down here, and you can actually drain off some compost leachate or worm casting leachate off the bottom there. And so it really has been very well thought out. I've had a lot of luck with it. But how do you go about getting this thing set up? Well, what you want to do is you want to take your excess trays off, and you want to come down to the bottom tray. Now, what I'm going to show you now, you only do on the bottom tray. As you start building up your levels, you don't continue to do this first step. And the first step is to put a sheet of newspaper in the bottom tray. The reason for that is that when you put your earthworms in here, they're like it's a new home for them. They're not sure where everything is, and they crawl around a little bit. You want to discourage them from crawling down. If they do crawl down into the tray down here, it's possible for them to crawl back up, but it's really best to try to discourage that. So you want to start with some newspaper and just put one or two sheets of paper, but you do want to cover up all the little holes down in the bottom of the tray. So I will put that one, get it down in there nicely, and then I'll put this second one so that everything is covered. Okay, so that's going to keep them from going down. Now that's very dry paper, so we want to moisten it. I'm actually going to moisten it using some Boogie Brew compost tea. Now, I think in the instructions they say you can just do it with water. I would suggest using purified water or reverse osmosis water, or if you're going to use tap water, let it sit out, because anytime you're trying to build living systems, you don't want to dump chlorine into it. And it's much more, the composting is much more than just keeping the worms alive. You want the vermicompost itself to be alive, which means you want a lot of microfungi and microbacteria and all of these little microenvironments living environment to start developing. So the last thing you want to do is pour chlorine into it. The reason I use the Boogie Brew tea is that I feel like this helps kickstart that living biomatter in the microdomain there, the micro living organisms in the soil. This helps start it because this is actually brewed in a fermentation process, and it is just teeming with living material. And so what I want to do is I want to do my wetting of the newspapers with a little of this tea, and this tea will then have a kick-starting effect to help get some of those microorganisms growing in our vermicompost. Okay, and you could use any tea with living matter in it. If you need help getting started, if you look at my link on extremepreppers.com, I've got some links where you can order what I'm using here. Okay, so that newspaper is nice and moist. And now the next step that we need to do is we need to create a bedding. We need to create a bedding for the worms. And the nice thing is the Worm Factory 360 comes with some coconut coir, and therefore it gives you a nice starting material to create the bedding. And so what you need to do is just pour some water. And again, all of this I like to use RO or other water that does not have chlorine in it. And you want to pour just enough water on the coconut to let it expand. And that takes a few minutes. It's got to absorb the water. And I suggest kind of going slow. You don't want to go too quickly on this because you will end up with too much water. You also want to wait and make sure that you don't have a dry spot in the middle. And so what I will do is I will continue to add water until all of this core is nice and moist, but not saturated. So I'm going to give this a minute or two to soak in, and then I'll be right back. A few minutes, and it's nice and moist. You can see that coconut coir that they provide makes a nice amount of this bedding. Also, I should have mentioned that they send you a brick of the coir. To get a level started, you only need to use half of a brick. Okay, you don't need to use the whole brick. Half of a brick will be more than what you need, and you can see that it completely filled this bowl up. How do you know when it's moist enough? Well, you want to kind of be able to pick it up and squeeze it, and you want to feel that it's moist, but you don't want to be wringing water out of it. If you're wringing water out of it like a wash rag, you've got too much. You can see that I have it just nice and fluffy, so I have it just about perfect. Now what I want to do is I'm going to pour this coconut coir into the first level of the worm farm, and I want to have it on top of the moist newspaper that I put in there. So at this point, I've got a nice place for the worms to live, make them happy, make them want to stay there, make them want to enjoy their new home. The other thing that you want is some shredded paper. Okay, the shredded paper also is something that they like as a bedding. And so I'll put a handful of shredded paper in there with the coconut coir. So now I've got the bedding, I've got a nice friendly place for the worms to live. I'll make them happy in their new home. But there's a couple of other things, and good news is these things come with the Worm Factory 360 kit. This is Soil Key Minerals. Now, one of the reasons that you're doing the composting is that you want to bring more nutritional value to your food. So the food that you grow in the compost that you're making here, you want to be nutritionally dense. Well, the thing that you've got to think about is that if I feed the earthworms table scraps, and these table scraps are vegetables that I got at the grocery store, these might not be rich in minerals, okay? And there's a lot of magic that the earthworms do, but they cannot create they cannot create an element if the element is not there. If selenium is not in this table scrap from the grocery store, putting that table scrap into this worm bin and having the worms eat it and excrete worm castings, those worm castings are not going to have selenium in it. And as you know, most of our commercial farmland, the minerals are depleted. So the way that we're going to ensure that the food that we grow is mineralized is to put some minerals back into this worm bed, and then as the worms process the food scraps, will be generating not just nutritionally dense soil, but also soil that has the minerals put back in. And so I would say probably use, a tablespoon or so of this. And so I'll just kind of put it here like this and put it in there. This is from the Nature's Footprint that was provided with the system. I think that as I progress here, I'm not going to continue to buy these little bottles. I'll probably just go to some azomite. And azomite is a mineral dust that you can get in 50-pound bags. Man, it is great if you can find it locally. I cannot find it locally, and so I ordered it off of Amazon. It's about $50 for 50 pounds. 50 pounds will last you a long, long time if you're using a tablespoon at a time, but it's a lot cheaper than buying the little replacement bottles here. The next thing that we need to put in here is that the worms are a little bit like chickens. They don't have teeth, and they have a little bit of a gizzard that they need to crush the material up with. So they need some little rocks, and the little rocks will get in their gizzard and allow them to process the food fully. The Worm Factory 360 comes with some pumice. And again, it's a little bag. It's nice because it allows you to get started. And so we'll get a little handful of the pumice, and we'll put in there. Again, once you get going, I would probably not want to buy these little bags. I would just find a big bag. Always first try to buy it locally, because if you can buy it locally, a big bag of it locally at a garden supply store, then you're not having to pay the shipping. The problem is I have not been able to find the pumice at the big box stores, and our local garden store infrastructure is very limited here. So I bought that at Amazon as well. So that's an option. Again, on my website, I give you a link, but I suggest that you try to buy local first, because that's a lot cheaper if you don't get hit with the shipping. And even with free shipping, you're paying shipping when you're buying a 50-pound bag of something. So let's see here. I've got some nice moist coconut core. I have some nice shredded paper. I have some minerals, and I have the pumice. And so that's looking really good. I'm going to take my Boogie Brew compost tea, and I'm going to spray that again. Again, I'm just trying to kind of get it inoculated with some of this really great living microorganisms that are in my tea, and kind of get things jump started. And now I've got the bedding basically ready to go. But the worms need more than just bedding. They need something to eat. And so what I have here are some table scraps. I think that really, if you want to compost the fastest possible, you want to chop the table scraps up into little bitty pieces. The problem is I just don't have time for that, because every day I've got a lot of things to do, so I don't really go in and chop it into little bitty pieces. I just put it into chunks. Maybe I will break this up. This is a bok choy stem, and I'll break it up into pieces and put it in there. What you want to do is you kind of want to put the food a little bit in one corner so that they can kind of find it. So I'll break it up, and then what I want to do is I want to bury it a little bit. And the reason I want to bury it is I want to put it down in that bedding, not just so the worms will find it, but I don't want it exposed up to the air, where you run the risk of some not so beneficial bugs getting into your worm bin. And so by burying the food that you put in there, then what you will find is that it helps mitigate the problem of having gnats or ants or something else like that get into your worm bin. Okay, so we've got the bedding, we've got the minerals, we've got the pumice, we've got a little food for it to get started. The next step is to just dump the worms in. If you can buy the worms locally, definitely buy the worms locally. The two types of worms that I've played with that work real well is I like the African night crawlers, and I like the red wigglers, and both of those are just voracious composters. And again, try to find them locally. If you can't find them locally, I've got some links on Amazon. If you go to www.extremepreppers.com or go to this link here, it will show you where you can get some of this stuff if you have trouble finding it locally or finding a good deal on it locally. So how many worms to get? The worms are a little bit pricey. I would suggest starting with 1,000 worms at least, because yes, you'll put worms in there, and yes, they will gradually multiply, but it's kind of like starting a car. You know, you really want to have good, clean, fresh fuel, and you want to have plenty of it to get it started. Well, here it's the same thing. I don't want to wait and wait and wait for my worms to multiply. And if you get a pack of 1,000, that's enough to really jumpstart this and to get your worm operation in your composting going very quickly. And so I would suggest using about 1,000 worms to get this thing started. Okay, well that's the introduction as far as how to get the thing started. Let's give it a little time. I'm going to give it about a month and come back, and then I'll talk to you again about how things are looking. Okay, guys, I've let this go for somewhat over a month now. And just every few days I've been feeding it, and then I did go ahead and add a second tray, and now I'm just about ready to add a third tray. So what I want to do is I want to go in and sort of show you how these things develop. When you add a new tray, remember you do not put a newspaper in the bottom. You do not put a newspaper in the bottom when you add a new tray, because what you want is you want the worms from the lower tray to move up into the upper tray, so you don't want to block them with that newspaper. That newspaper is just for your first tray to keep them from going down, but the additional trays you put on, you make them just like the first tray, only you don't put that bottom level of newspaper in there. Sometimes they suggest to cover your vermicompost in the bedding with a sheet of newspaper. I've found that that's really not necessary, and the newspaper kind of gets in the way and slows me down. So I don't do that. I've had no problems just leaving the bedding exposed. But what I've been doing is I've been coming in every few days or every day and adding some scraps. And so let's look in here and see how things are looking. I'm going to tell you ahead of time that this bottom level is pretty much completely composted, and I kind of got to the point that I really couldn't add more stuff. It had filled up, so I let them finish that, and then I started feeding the second level, and then now that the second level is almost full, it's really time to add the third level. And as I add the third level, it's time to get the first, kind of harvest the first compost and take out that compost from the bottom level. So let's look down in this and see how things have developed over the last month or so. Okay, so let's look down in here and see what we have. We'll take the lid off, and then my top level is empty. It's time to add a layer here. My middle level is really looking processed, and so if you come in here and look, you can see that there is a lot of vermicompost. It is almost completely full, and you can see that it's mostly processed. Now, one of the things you can see is there's a bunch of white chunks that have not been processed, and that is cabbage. And so my worms apparently do not like the cabbage. But if I reach down in here, let's just see if I can pull up some worms for you to see. Okay, let's see there. You see that is just crawling with worms, big, healthy, active, beautiful worms. And so my worms are very healthy, my worms are very happy, my worms are very active, but they don't like cabbage very much. And so this is a little bit of a dilemma that I have to deal with is that they will eat the cabbage, but anything else that is in there, they're going to eat first. And so if I put any more food in here, they will go eat that and not eat the cabbage. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this level active. I'm not going to put any more food in there, and I'm going to kind of make them eat the cabbage just to get it processed. But then in the future, I'm not going to put cabbage in here because it sort of throws things off that I'm like ready to get them to move up to the next level, but they haven't finished eating the cabbage yet. And so when I find something like cabbage that they don't like very much, then I just don't use that. And I'll use the cabbage that I have left over just in an outdoor composting bin and not try to fool with it. But I've just learned that that is not working very well. Okay, so this was my second level. Again, I'm ready to now start a third level, and as they're finishing up the cabbage, some will move up and start eating stuff in the third level. But let's go down and look at the first level. What you can see in the first level is just really rich, fully processed vermicompost. Okay. Do you see how beautiful that is? The other thing about the vermicompost is to smell it. when you smell it, it's just a rich, beautiful smell. There's no hint at all of sewer smell, no hint at all of fermentation smell. It's just really this rich, beautiful smell. And it smells, to me, it's a little bit reminiscent of how it smells when it rains. You know, it's just a really, really wonderful odor. Now, the other thing you'll notice in this lower level is everything has been processed. We don't see any chunks of food left. And we see very, very few earthworms. So most of the worms have migrated up to the top. Here's a guy here. He's kind of got left behind, so I will go ahead and I will throw him in there. And so really, this is ready to process now. What I'll do is I will take this, I will put it in a bag, and then I will take it out into the greenhouse and then start incorporating this tray into my growing. If there's a few left behind, that's okay. But the really neat thing is you don't have to fuss with it very much. When they're ready to move up, they move up. And then when we look in here, I find very few earthworms. So they have kind of self-harvested and gone up to that next level. And so what you can see is that we can just continue to cycle through, and we're producing lots and lots of beautiful, beautiful compost. Okay, a couple of things that I've learned and that I'll share with you as we're going through this. First thing that's really, really important, so I've shown you how to set it up. I've taken you through the first couple of rotations. A couple of other things that are really, really important. Number one is the temperature. Now, I just really think that in most parts of the country, you're just going to have to bite the bullet, and this is going to have to be an indoor project. The temperature range is rather limited on these things, and if you start getting much above 80 degrees, the worms are not going to be happy. If you start getting up to probably about 90 degrees, the worms are going to die. And so you really want to, they're comfortable where you're comfortable, and so you really want them at room temperature. I even looked a little bit about, you know, my wife was very less than enthusiastic about having the worms in the house. She's gotten used to it now. She sees that they're not a problem and it's okay. So she really wanted to encourage me to do something else with them. Even looked into the garage, but just when I looked at the garage, our garage is too hot in the summer. It's too cold in the winter. So we put the worm bins out here on the sun porch. It's completely closed in and it's room temperature, and they just seem to be thriving in here year round. They're happy in the summer. They're happy in the winter. And so I really suggest that if you're going to grow these earthworms in most parts of the country, you need to grow them inside. Now, I know if you get the large systems outside, there's ways that you can grow them outside, and people have done it successfully. But as far as the Worm Factory 360 and really getting off to a strong start, control the temperature. If you don't have just 70-degree year-round weather, really think about putting them inside. The second thing that's really important is don't overfeed. You don't just come in and dump whatever scraps you have in here every day. You need to be watching and seeing, are you getting a lot of food that the worms aren't getting around to? Because what will start happening, which you don't want to happen, is if you're putting the food in too quickly, number one, the food can start rotting before the worms eat it. You can start getting an odor of the rotting food. And then if, the other thing is that as it rots, it will start becoming too moist. Your environment here will become too moist. The worms don't want that much moisture. They can feel like there's a flood, and then they can start trying to get away. That's not good. And then the final thing is that if you start getting the food to decompose before the worms are eating it, that increases the chance that you're going to be putting out odors that's going to attract gnats or fruit flies or some unpleasant type of fly. So I would really suggest that you not overfeed. So we're going to control the temperature. We're not going to overfeed. We're not going to underfeed. If you put some food in there and come back the next day and everything is gone, then maybe you are not feeding it enough. So you got to kind of play it by ear. What I typically do is it's just table scraps from the house and the kitchen my wife throws in here, and then I come in, I just kind of watch it, and a bowl of scraps a day for a worm bin that is really moving usually is about the right amounts. Okay, so temperature, don't overfeed, don't underfeed. But if you're doing things right, this should smell just really fresh. You shouldn't get a fruit fermentation smell. You shouldn't be getting a sewer smell. If you're getting a sewer smell, that's indicating an anaerobic fermentation, and you don't want that. This should be aerobic. It should be with oxygen, and then everything smells good. Everything is good. If you start smelling something that smells like sewer or smells like potty water, you are feeding it too much, and the stuff is getting too moist, and it is starting to break down in a way that's not good. So we want this to smell nice and fresh. Okay, it should not smell like the sewer. Things that you should feed and things that you should not feed. I found that just about any vegetable matter that I'll put in here, they'll eat. I showed you a little bit earlier that they don't like cabbage very much. So if I just put in a mix of stuff, they're going to eat everything except the cabbage. Then you're going to have this nice processed vermicompost, and you're going to have cabbage chunks in it. And then if you put another level on, they're going to move up to the other level, and they will only eat the cabbage as a last resort. So what I try to do is I try to put food in here that they like, and then any food that they don't like, which I have found, citrus is not really something you want to put in here. Cabbage, they really don't like very much. And I've also found sometimes they seem to be avoiding the onions. So those types of food I'll just throw outside in a bin, and then I will let them eat the things that they like in here. Okay. Final question about these things and about feeding them is, what about poop? Okay, I've got sheep, and sheep generate massive amounts of poop, and I can just go out and scoop it up, and it would be great to get that turned into compost. But what I found is that if I put the poop in here and put it with grapes, when given a chance between grapes and poop, the worms will eat the grapes. And it's the same problem as the cabbage problem. They'll eat the lettuce, and they'll eat the grapes, and they'll eat the strawberries before they'll eat the poop, and they only want to eat the poop as a kind of as a last resort. But in that case, I really, really want to compost that poop, because the sheep are out free-ranging, eating natural, organic, free-range grasses. And so that's like really good organic material, and that's the organic material that I want to be composting. So what I'm doing is basically I'm running two of these things, one that I'm putting the food scraps in, and the second one that I'm only putting the sheep poop in. And if they don't have any choice except sheep poop, they get after it. And I might be imagining this, but it seems like a colony of worms sort of adapts itself to what you're feeding it. And if you get them going on the sheep poop, then they just go after it, and it works great. So in one, I'm throwing the table scraps, the food scraps, the kitchen scraps. In the other one, I am using the poop. And then anything that doesn't seem to work well in the composting bins, the worm bins, I will throw those outside just into a traditional compost. Okay, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope that you found it helpful. If you have any questions, put the questions down below. Also, if you like this, think about giving me a thumbs up. Think about maybe even subscribing to the channel. Again, this is Paul McWhorter with ExtremePreppers.com. I will talk to you guys later.